Hello, my name is Edwin Coomasaru. I'm a research fellow at the Paul Mahon Centre and co-convener of the Courtauld's Gender and Sexuality Research Group with Dr Rachel Warriner, a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Courtauld. This is our first public event and it's really wonderful to welcome you all. Please use the hashtag #ViolentFluids to tweet about the discussion. You can also tag us on Twitter with @CourtauldGS. It would be great to hear any of your comments, thoughts, or questions as the event unfolds. It's a real pleasure to have our speakers, Dr Hetta Howes and Dr Camilla Mørk Røstvik, here today. Each will talk for approximately 20 minutes before we open out to a Q&A with both. I will introduce them properly before they give their papers. But first, I want to say a brief note about the theme for tonight's event. The discussion this evening will throw up questions about blood, its social histories, and the way it has long been implicated in forms of violence. It is a fluid both co-opted into conservative gender norms and often also radically disrupts them. Sadly, my colleague Rachel Warriner can't join me as a host tonight because she's currently on maternity leave. But her research considers the way pain and the body have been entangled in complex ways in feminist art. My own research on the Northern Irish Troubles looked at both the role of blood as a symbol in images of male martyrdom, as well as depictions of female paramilitary prisoners who took part in the 1980 to 81 no-wash protest in Armagh Jail, like Maid Murphy's 2001 film Silent Grace. The Republican women smeared excreta and menstrual blood on the walls of their cells in an act of collective defiance in opposition to the criminalization of their cause. Living in such conditions also caused some of the women to stop menstruating, throwing up complex questions about the ways in which menstruation itself is often co-opted into definitions of womanhood. Perhaps that's something we can talk about later. Our talks tonight will develop and deepen our understanding of the fraught issues around blood as a material and a symbol, and what it might tell us about the societies that try or fail to contain it. I think it's quite interesting that the artworks used to advertise tonight's event are both images of men made up of blood in the presence of a female figure, either as an illustration or the artist. While the relationship between the fluid and ideas of gender are complex, contestable, and unstable, tracing the ways it has changed in our collective imagination over large spans of time can expose how power and politics have shaped its understandings. Our speakers will examine the complex meanings blood held in specific times and places, and consider the ways in which it might be an unruly fluid, both circulating across and leaking between genders and bodies. Before we begin, just a quick note about how the Q&A will work. You can either post your questions on Twitter by using the #ViolentFluids hashtag, or wait until the papers are finished and then use the raise your hand function on Zoom, and we will unmute you and you'll be able to ask them. So without further ado, to introduce our first speaker, Dr Hetta Howes is a lecturer in medieval literature at City University of London. Interested in fluid imagery and its manifestation in religious writings for women, she is published on the relationship between blood and shame in a medieval passion lyric on the imagery of water in Aelred Ribot's Treaty for the Anchoress, and on new approaches to medieval water studies. She is currently working on a monograph based on her doctoral research, tentatively entitled Transformative Waters, forthcoming with Boydell and Brewer. Committed to public engagement and a BBC AHRC New Generation Thinker 2017, she's a regular contributor to BBC Radio 3's Free Thinking and a presenter for the BBC HRC New Thinking podcast. So yeah, I'd like to welcome Hetta.
I am new to this Zoom seminar, so thank you so much, Eddie, for that introduction and for the invitation, and to Rachel as well. I'm really thrilled to be able to, even in sort of an ease lockdown, be able to chat with this many people. I've been watching the participants number go up with excitement. I've tried to make this talk as widely applicable as possible. I'm aware there'll be people here who are medieval experts, people here who don't know anything about it. So I've tried to make it as sort of accessible as I can. And I'm just going to share the screen now because I've got a few slides that I'm going to share with you to illustrate what I'm talking about. So if that isn't working, I'm sure someone will tell me in the chat. So I will put my timer on. It's always important to keep to time even on the internet. And then I'll get started. Right. Housed in the British Library, there is a medieval manuscript that looks as though it has been literally dipped in blood. The British Library MS Egerton 1821, to give it its full title, is a compilation of devotional writings dated to 1421. The first few pages, which you can see hopefully on this slide, are painted black and spattered with thick red drops of blood, almost as if the blood is trickling down them. And then if I move to the next, oh, it says sharing is paused. I will. So there we go. So as I was saying, this is a manuscript in the British Library dated to around 1421. And as you can see on this first slide, the first few pages are painted black, but spattered with thick red drops as if blood is trickling down them. And then the pages turn red. If I can show you on the next slide. And we kind of have these rows and rows of open dripping wounds. If I move to the next bit of the manuscript, you can see two woodcuts, both of Christ, both of Christ's Passion. So in the first woodcut, Christ is covered in blood and surrounded by arma Christi, which is Latin for instruments of Christ's Passion. It's sort of a very common trope in medieval art of the Passion, including the nails for his hands and feet and a scourge for his back. In the second, not only is his body bleeding, but blood seems to actually rain down from the sky or the top of the manuscript. And we have underlining this image the words, and I quote, "The greatest comfort in all temptation is a remembrance of Christ's passion." Marks on the parchment, which experts believe were caused by touching, scratching, and even kissing, suggest a visceral and physical response to these illustrations. It's as if the first reader were trying to reach through the very pages, either to relive the suffering of Christ, or perhaps to enter into his sufferings with him. These blood-soaked pages of the Egerton manuscript are really unique. We don't really see anything like it in other medieval manuscripts, but their iconography of a bloody, suffering Christ on the cross are not so unique. I remember many audiences some time ago being horrified at the ultra-violence of Mel Gibson's film The Passion of Christ in 2004, particularly the flogging scene, in which you see sort of chunks of Christ's flesh coming at the screen as the soldiers marvel at just how much suffering one human body can take. But there are a number of medieval descriptions or visual reconstructions of Christ's torture and death that I think could give that film a run for its money, particularly in terms of the excess of blood. In the Gospel, the narration of the events of Christ's suffering during his imprisonment and crucifixion is sparse. We don't get a lot of detail. It's very matter of fact. We're told that Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, that a crown of thorns was placed on Christ's head, and that he was nailed to the cross. But there's barely any mention of Christ's blood. There's no labouring of it. And in fact, crucifixion itself is not a particularly bloody death. Victims tend to die of suffocation or dehydration rather than blood loss. If you sort of cast your eye to the woodcut on your screen, it looks there as if something bloody would definitely be the cause of death. But actually, no. In the early Middle Ages, the focus of Christian art and literature is very much on Christ as a warrior rather than Christ as a suffering victim. So still not very much blood. A good example of this is the poem The Dream of the Rood, which is a really trippy poem dated somewhere between the 8th and the 10th century. In it, a talking tree turns out to be the cross on which Christ was crucified. Christ leaps onto the tree, the instrument of his death, without hesitation or apparent pain, and he embraces it, that's the word that's used, fearlessly. But by the later Middle Ages, something has changed. The brave warrior laughing at his fate is replaced both in artistic and written representations by the more stoic man of sorrows, the tormented body, bleeding and broken, suffering for the sins of humanity. So like the image you can see on your screen now, I've got another example here as well. Well, two. One is from the sort of anonymous manuscript linked to a Bridgerton manuscript, and the other one is from British Library Additional, it's a version of the Charter of Christ, which is quite a common trope in the Middle Ages, the idea that there's a legal document that Christ offers, but that becomes his body, that he's sort of offering his body as a grant to the saved. But what you'll notice, as with the previous image, is that there is a lot of blood, a lot of wounds in both these images. Christ is no longer a distant godlike figure removed from the experience of the everyday. He has become someone who suffers just like us, and therefore someone within our reach. This new emphasis on Christ's humanity and his capacity for very real pain and suffering is designed to deepen the faith medieval Christians had by asking them to face Christ's torment head on. It's not enough to just understand intellectually, abstractly, that God's Son gave his life for the Christian people. In the Middle Ages, everyday Christians are asked to really feel it. And images like this are testament to that. Medieval authors turn the spotlight on Christ's suffering in a number of ways, but most creatively, to my mind, through a genre of writing known as passion meditation. One of the first and most energetic of these was penned by the Yorkshire Cistercian abbot, Aelred of Rievaulx, one of my favourites, in the 12th century. In the final section of a guidebook that he writes for a sister who was living an enclosed religious life, Aelred invites her to purge her heart of any unsavoury thoughts and cast a clear eye back to the life and death of Christ, paying particular attention to his arrest, torture, and death. Rather than encouraging her to imagine herself as a witness to such scenes, a passive bystander, Aelred rather encourages her to be an active participant or imagine herself as such. So he asks her a number of questions. How many bitter tears will run out of your eyes when you imagine the sufferings of Christ's mother Mary? Aelred asks his sister as he walks her through this meditation. Why are your eyes dry? He continues. Why aren't you sobbing? Really trying to get an emotional response from her to these sort of imagined images of Christ's suffering. He encourages her to imagine that she's washing Christ's feet with her hot tears, just as Mary Magdalene did, and to run to his breasts and suck nourishing milk from them. This image of breastfeeding might seem quite odd to a modern audience, but it was a pretty common trope in medieval devotional writing, the idea that just as a mother nourishes and nurtures her child with her breast milk, so does Christ his followers. And both men and women imagine breastfeeding Christ's breasts. When Christ's side is pierced with a lance after death, Aelred urges his sister to run up to him and to drink the life-giving blood that pours out of his many wounds until her lips become as red as scarlet ribbons. She does not only visualize Christ's suffering, she interacts with it. And Aelred encourages her to return to these bloody scenes imaginatively as often as she can, to see them every time she closes her eyes and remember what anguish she, a human and therefore a sinner, has caused her God. Aelred was writing this in the 12th century. By the 14th, this genre had exploded. It was really popular. Margery Kempe, another of my favourites, a 14th century medieval mystic who was famous for dissolving into tears whenever she thought about Christ's passion, was clearly familiar with the genre. On pilgrimage to Jerusalem, she describes a vision in which she comforts the Virgin Mary, who has fallen down in grief at the sight of her son, and encourages her to rise up so that they can both keep Christ in their sights for as long as possible. She tells us that she sees Christ's wounds bleeding as freshly as if he had been whipped in front of her very eyes, sees the nails being driven into his hands and feet. Kempe clearly takes seriously the advice from religious authorities that she should keep Christ's suffering constantly in her mind's eye. All it takes is a horse being whipped or a child being beaten for Kempe to be immediately transported to the moment of Christ's suffering. Richard Roller, a Yorkshire hermit born around 70 years before Kempe, describes Christ's blood as a sweet bath, which can melt his stony heart. And he says that one of his greatest desires is to roll around in the blood until he is covered all over, red all over, much like the scarlet ribbons that I mentioned earlier of the anchoress's lips. These are not images or descriptions which hold Christ and his suffering at a remove. Again and again, we find written records of devoted Christians who were not satisfied with just remembering Christ's passion, but who wanted to bring it to life before their eyes so that they could feel, I think this is a significant thing, more involved in it, to feel, to taste and smell the blood, to ingest it, immerse themselves in it, bathe in it, mark themselves with it. And in this context, the bloody pages of Egerton 1821, the manuscript that I showed you to start with, and the marks caused by kisses and caresses that remain on it, start to make a lot more sense. They reveal a desire to share, to interact, to cross the bridge of the page, as if the reader were trying to enter into the brutal world of the manuscript itself. And this explains too the focus on Christ's wounds in Egerton 1821, those rows and rows of leaking lesions and suppurations. These wounds are the entryway, the portal to Christ's suffering. And as you can see, blood is everywhere in them. Something that I'm particularly interested in for my own research is how this idea of Christ's wounds and blood as an entryway for the devoted had a particular resonance for women. It's not exclusively for women, but you do see more images in texts that are for women. So for example, there's fairly good evidence that Egerton 1821 was for a female patron. In the Revelations of Julian of Norwich, an anchoress who Margery Kempe sought out for guidance on at least one occasion, Julian describes seeing Christ before her as if at the moment of crucifixion. Slowly, gently, Christ in her vision stretches open the wound in his side until it's gaping wide enough for her to crawl inside. And she tells us that it's wide enough for all of mankind to do so. It's no coincidence that in many manuscripts, images of the wound in Christ's side bear a startling resemblance to another kind of entryway, a far more feminine one, the vulva. And I've got an image of this. There's so many, but this is sort of one archetypal image from the Psalter of a Bohemian princess in 1349. So this is the wound in Christ's side, or it looks as much like a vulva as it does anything else. Images like this one reveal a direct link, and I'm thinking of what Eddie introduced here, his lovely introduction, this idea of sort of bodies that seem to be more gender fluid, perhaps, because here there's a direct link between women's bodies and Christ's body. And this sort of artistic representation leaks into, if you'll excuse the pun, literary depictions of Christ as well. So for example, in an unillustrated anonymous prayer sequence from the 15th century, which was written by a woman for a female reader, a comparison is drawn between the side of the Virgin Mary in childbirth and the wound in Christ's side at crucifixion. Whilst devotional works that focus on Christ's blood are not written exclusively for women, there does seem to be a special resonance for them, which is partly explained by the medieval belief that women's bodies, like the suffering body of Christ, are marked by fluids and by excess. In the Middle Ages, it was a truth universally acknowledged that women were a bit wet. Aristotle was still the sort of main order of the day in terms of medieval medicine. And his model for understanding gender is at the heart of much misogynistic rhetoric of the medieval period, and indeed of today, actually. According to Aristotle, nature wants to create the most perfect animal, the male, but adverse reproductive conditions can result in an unfortunate second best, the imperfect female. Hello. In this model, babies are born female because they haven't received enough heat during gestation. Therefore, women are wet, cold, and weak by nature. Men are, by contrast, hot, dry, and strong. Lucky them. Because women are not hot enough to process their excess moisture properly, their bodily fluids are also thought to be runnier, more likely to escape the boundaries of the body, something which provoked disgust and horror in male writers. Women's bodies needed a way to purge this excess liquid, and this is how medieval thinkers explained, but did not excuse, the monthly purging that persists as a taboo to this very day. This is how periods, according to the medieval medical theory, were a way of purging this excess fluid. Even in the 21st century, periods are an uncomfortable topic of conversation, and I think we'll be hearing more about that from Camilla in the next talk. Discussion of menstruation is repeatedly used to silence or discredit women. Donald Trump, one of the most powerful men on the planet, is of course guilty of this. He explained away the tenacious questioning he received from Megyn Kelly of Fox News by hinting that it might be her time of the month. You could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, he said, blood coming out of her wherever. So afraid of periods. This is actually surprisingly similar to a medieval old wife's tale. All that blood had to go somewhere, and if it didn't escape through the natural channels, the fear was that it might rise up and leak out of a woman's eyeballs as the evil eye. Basically, Trump's attitude is nothing new, and it has many of its roots in the medieval period. There was already a religious stigma against menstruation in the Middle Ages. According to the Bible, the pain of childbirth, and therefore the menstruation that makes women fertile, was a curse, a punishment originally visited on Eve for eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And this biological understanding only strengthened the negative view of what is in reality just a natural bodily function. Women were seen as incontinent in other ways too. An anonymous medical treatise called Women's Secrets informs us that women cry more often because they need to purge excess moisture from their bodies, as they do when they bleed once a month. So the male author tells us that weeping, and I quote, is indicative of women's ignorance, for dampness coarsens the women's brains and hinders their ability to learn. It points to their excessive wickedness, for it is by way of abundant tears that evil humours leave the body through the eyes. Water becomes a sign of a woman's sin and her stupidity, both of which are part and parcel of her biological makeup. There's a link here between women, water, blood, and Christ, which I'm especially interested in, and which I discuss at more length in my forthcoming book, as soon as I can get back in the library. Women's bodies, according to medieval theological and medical belief, were apparently excessively watery, leaky, and suffering in their incompleteness. If you sort of call back to your mind the images I showed you of sort of a bloody Christ on the cross, you can see that these images represent a body that is suffering and leaking, blood and water gushing from the wound in Christ's side. Women could see, I think, in such evocative images, or perhaps a mirror of their own bodies, or at least the way they were told to think about their own bodies. Marjorie Kemp's tears flow forth in an excess matched by Christ's prodigious blood on the cross, which he shed in order to save her soul. Her tears are frequently described as not only a gift from God, but also a gift for God. Christ twice refers to Kemp's tears as a drink for God, Christ, his mother, and all the angels in heaven. Kemp herself prays to God that she might be granted a well of tears through which she may receive his precious body with all manner of tears of devotion. So she asks for God's body and his blood and offers her tears as a gift in return, both as a vehicle for receiving them and as a means for thanksgiving once they've been received. She thanked him, we're told, with great weepings and sobbings for his redemptive blood. Similarly, in the Passion meditations I described above, which are often directed at women, much of the participation Elred encourages involves water, licking the dust from Christ's feet, wiping away the spit of jeering bystanders, or washing the dirt from his body with their tears, women are invited to use their wetness to help them imagine and communicate with the divine. The relationship between women and water, so often expressed negatively, is turned on its head in such imageries. Water might be quite invisible in artistic representations of the Passion. We rarely see the blood and the water, but to my mind, it's a missing puzzle piece here, because it's water which facilitates participation in salvation, completing a more reciprocal exchange with Christ himself. Yes, he gives his blood, but so too can we potentially give water, or so we as in sort of the medieval Christian reader, as opposed to we us. The gospel tells us that blood and water flowed forth from Christ's side after his crucifixion. And today I've hoped to share with you some of my thoughts on the special relationship between these two fluids and their particular resonance for women in the Middle Ages. Thank you very much. And sorry about my mad technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that paper. I've seen Hetta speak before, and she's such a brilliant scholar, so intelligent, interesting, and imaginative, and I really appreciate having her here tonight. The connections you drew with Camilla's paper was also really exciting, and I'm so looking forward to discussing them all together afterwards. Okay, so I'll introduce Camilla now, and then we'll go through and have a Q&A all together. Dr Camilla Mørk Røstvik is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of Art History at the University of St Andrews, working on the project The Painters Are In, a visual history of menstruation since 1970. From 2019 to 2020, she was PI on the Wellcome Trust funded project, the UK Menstruation Research Network. Her book, Cash Flow, The Business of Menstruation Since 1970, is forthcoming with UCL Press in 2021. Welcome, welcome Camilla.
So thank you so much for having me. I was going to say it's very nice to be here, but I'm just sat in my bed. But it is nice to be in bed while you're working, I suppose. And I really hope my internet works. So everyone cross fingers for the internet here in rural Fife. So today I'm talking about the portrait that you can see in front of you, entitled Whatever Bloody Trump. It's by US-based artist Sarah Levy. It was made after that comment that Hetta mentioned from the then presidential candidate Donald Trump in 2015, and resulted in a viral online moment for the artist and the artwork. So today I want to make the case for this portrait as more than a piece of menstrual activism, as it was often referred as, but as a work that is also a political portrait and an investigation of racialized blood. And before we begin, the talk will include discussions of menstrual blood in great detail, and I know many people feel many ways about that, so just take it into account. I won't be giving any warnings before images. And separately, more seriously, the talk also touches on police brutality, George Floyd, and also anti-Semitism. So it's a tough time, and please, depending on how you feel today, just take that into account and take care of yourself. Okay, so let's see. There we go. So today I would like to talk about the creation and the reception of this artwork. I would like to look at where it sits in the history of menstrual art. And I'd like to look at the legacy of this artwork beyond 2015, because so much has happened since then. And in order to get there, I've interviewed the artist over email, and I've also done archival research into menstrual art more generally. So in August 2015, as Hetta mentioned, presidential candidate Donald J. Trump commented that news anchor Megyn Kelly was unreliable and difficult after she had questioned him somewhat critically. He suggested that she was, in fact, so angry that she had, quote, blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever. unquote. While Trump maintained that he actually meant a nosebleed, others assumed he was talking about menstrual blood. Now, menstrual blood has long been linked to gendered emotions, as we've just seen, whether through the stereotype of hysterical women or through the debate around whether or not premenstrual syndrome is real. In short, by suggesting a link between menstrual blood and a woman, Trump inserted himself, unknowingly I think, into a long history of discussions about the menstrual taboo. The quote and the critique of it received mainstream attention over the ensuing weekend, but quickly fizzled out as Trump said other things, and as he moved from candidate to president. As such, the work is a bit of a time capsule of the debate, and it takes us back to 2015, when many thought that Hillary Clinton would win. Trump not only inserted himself in the menstrual taboo debate, but also in the backlash against menstrual stigma. And that had begun again around December 2014. Memes and slogans about menstruation already existed by the time Trump made his statement, and a new hashtag, "periods are not an insult," was quickly created in order to critique Trump's perceived view of menstruation as embarrassing. This was just one part of the campaigning, it's important to say. Other issues included calls for more menstrual health research and better products. Activist efforts were quickly celebrated and covered by multinational corporations in their advertising and also mainstream news media. While menstrual rights has been a feminist and health issue in the US since the 1960s, this was the first time that non-gendered outlets, if we want to call them that, like Newsweek, began covering it. So you can also note the headline on that Newsweek cover about the Trump generation. So these two issues kind of explode at the same time. And while this was not the first time that menstrual product corporations appropriated feminist language, it was the first time that consumers seemed to celebrate and respond on such a large scale. As advertising censorship was relaxed in response to activism, advertisers were also able to show red liquid and use detailed anatomical language for the first time. In short, this was a time when menstrual visual language was reshaped and elevated. These changes, however, were often pioneered by artists. Menstrual art has a long history, but in 2015, artists received an unprecedented amount of attention for work involving menstruation. Most of these artists, and I'm just going to show you a few examples, are not menstrual artists, but they utilize the topic once in a while, or maybe just once. Poet and artist Rupi Kaur's infamous self-portrait photograph series was censored by Instagram in 2015, leading to a debate and a change in the company's rules about censorship. The photograph is a carefully composed series, ensuring that all colors and shapes in the textiles draw attention to the blood stain or blood-like colors. Her pose is one of either peace or discomfort, perhaps depending on your own views and your own experiences. In Sarah Maple's self-portrait from the same time, we see a completely different take. She's interested in the generational and cultural religious stigmas around menstruation in contemporary society. In stark contrast to all the adults around her, a small child is not offended by the menstrual stain that you can see again centralized in this image. But Maple is also interested in gendered blood more broadly and in how that intersects with her identity and interest in, let's see, it says here that my internet connection is unstable, so everyone cross your fingers again. So she's also interested in how this intersects with Muslim identity. Meanwhile, Sanel Moholi, also working on menstruation around the same time, their period paint series reflected very specific political situation in South Africa. Each menstrual image they make, including this indexical print of their own menstrual blood, records a new instance of violence or killing of queer people in South Africa, especially the horrific practice of correctional rape towards Black lesbians. As such, Moholy is recording history with their blood, referencing a very specific time and person each time, rather than generic menstrual themes. As Chris Bogle writes in her History of the Menstrual Activist Movement in the US, New Blood, quote, menstruation can seem like a trivial concern, but I contend that close inspection of menstrual culture and its hazards is not detached from political concerns. So with this kind of backdrop in mind, we can return to the image in question. The process of making this work involved the body of the artist and careful timing. After hearing Trump's remark, Levy had to wait till her next menstrual bleed in order to collect her material. You can't buy menstrual blood at the art shop. As such, there was already a great deal of bodily preparation involved in making the work. Finally, in order to collect it, the artist used a menstrual cup. This invention, dating back to the 19th century but popularized in the 21st, renders working with menstrual materials much easier than, for example, collecting blood with a tampon. Nevertheless, the method is challenging and requires the difficulty for the artist in overcoming any personal boundaries regarding sensing blood, which is quite normal. Furthermore, working with menstrual blood is complicated by the quick drying nature of the material and for its varied textures. Many menstrual artists have used, for example, egg whites to bind the material, but this can subtract some of the texture and color. Levy painted with a brush and tampon straight onto the canvas, making it necessary to work quickly. In composing the image, we see Trump menacingly filling the whole frame. By 2015, he is a recognizable figure and a very public person. Levy has caught him here mid-speech, head slightly dipped, neck suddenly ending. She has titled the image, Whatever, Bloody Trump, perhaps in response to his confusing wherever remark, as in blood coming out of her wherever. With this title, Levy seems to quote Trump, but does not do so directly. Her whatever suggests a somewhat distant observation, the artist in the role of social observer. Of all the details in the image, the most unsettling is perhaps the distorted eye. It's unclear whether it's open or closed, and seems in direct reference to Trump's line about anger making people see red. While the other eye is still open, this distorted detail refuses communication. He's so angry that he's been clouded by red. The use of blood further underlines the anger of the personality on display and the hectic movement of the mouth speaking. Upon creating the work, you can see to your right that the blood was a brighter hue of red, although this version I've got is slightly distorted, but it was much redder. It's since aged into a more rust-like color that you can see on the left, settling into a less bright appearance, more reminiscent of Trump's actual skin color, which is white and heavily tanned. It is also as if the artist has stripped away a layer of skin, exposing the blood vessels underneath. The use of blood here is not only in reference to the quote, but a useful comment on the kind of bloodlust politics of Donald Trump at the time. Most analysis of the work focused on a more formalist analysis that was concerned mostly with the materials used and stopped short of looking at the kind of broader political figure and the subject matter. Yet, menstrual blood is the material here and Trump the subject matter. The material and the subject matter reflect Trump's comments about menstruation, but they also function as a critique of the politics of Donald Trump at the time. While news coverage of the artwork redirected most attention back to Trump's initial comments, this was not the first time that the artist had been interested in this man. Levy had drawn Corey Wise and Antron McCrae, both men wrongfully convicted and racially profiled for a rape in Central Park in the 1980s, and they became known alongside 3 other young African Americans as the Central Park Five. In 1989, Trump waded into the debate with a full-page advertisement calling for more police powers and a return of the death penalty, calling out the Central Park Five as villains. The episode foreshadowed how his campaign and presidency would make white supremacy a seductive political tool. Levy, in her portrait of Antron and Corey, has chosen to depict them as men rather than boys, aged after years in prison. In contrast to the Trump image, she has used time to carefully sketch and detail the likeness of their faces. At the edges of their bodies, I've kind of cut out here, the lines are hectic, moving as if the image is alive. The eyes are open and look at the viewer directly. Levy has used charcoal for this portrait. These portraits. Like blood, charcoal is organic matter, but in contrast to the Trump image, analysis of the artwork depicting the Central Five tends to focus mostly on the subject matter and not the material. While Trump's likeness is discussed in relation to the material, Antron and Corey can never escape their history. As art historians have pointed out many times, eyes that follow viewers around the room, like these, have a disturbing effect of their own in that they never blink. There is stillness in these images, but in Levy's vibrating line outside the profiles and with the unblinking, let's see, have I got a message here? You still got the connection? Yes. And with the unblinking eyes, the faces seem to suggest a lack of peace. As such, they echo the activist call for no justice, no peace, first utilized in the 1980s in response to the murder of Michael Griffith, and used by the Black Lives Matter group today. Let's see, I just have a message from our, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna keep going because I think you can see my screen. I think someone had a problem, but I'm gonna keep going.
Yep, everything looks good, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So the point is, while Trump can close his eyes easily, these men cannot. Levy's interest in Trump's racist politics has continued. In her 2020 charcoal portrait of George Floyd, we see the same unblinking eyes. We see, however, no vibrating lines of movement, suggesting stillness. When Floyd was killed by police officers during an arrest 1 month ago, many artists created murals, sketches, and online imagery to celebrate his life, often taking inspiration from Floyd's own selfies, but also to accompany the activist cry to say victims' names. In documenting faces, it is even more difficult to forget, as images can transgress linguistic and sensory boundaries. Like the Central Park Five, Trump is inextricably linked to Floyd. For Levy, there has always been a link between racism and Trump, and this is what she's interested in interrogating if you look at her larger body of work. From the Central Park Five in the 80s to the racist campaigning of 2015 to the presidency of 2020. In documenting Floyd, Levy documents US history. Yet, whatever bloody Trump was by far the most attention Levy had received for an artwork. It became a viral sensation, spreading equally as an object of celebration and hatred. Levy writes that it was the nature of social media, which she was unfamiliar with, that meant that people saw it, because whether you read an article that ridiculed it or celebrated, you had to see the image. The people who disliked the image sent countless emails and letters to Levy. These responses were not, on a whole, about menstruation. Rather, they were anti-Semitic attacks on Levy. Let me see, you've just got the chat again. Oh. Okay. Sorry, I'm probably getting out of my timing here. Let's see. Rather, they were anti-Semitic attacks on Levy. She shared some of the hundreds of horrific comments she received with me, and it was clear that many included correlations between Jewish blood and racial purity, connecting Levy's image to a long history of anti-Semitic writings and commentary about the Jewish body and menstrual blood. This has recently been explored by, amongst others, Joanne Owusu. Through examining Levy's other artworks, it becomes clear that her larger body of work is interested in documenting racism in the US, and her own experience plays into this as well. These are important factors in understanding whatever bloody Trump. And although menstrual researchers have spent little time contending with this, it is true that a lot of menstrual taboos are constructed on the basis not only of patriarchy, but also of racist notions of blood. So, where does the image sit in the history of menstrual art? And if we examine Levy's work in the context of subject matter as well as materiality, what stories might be unearthed of other iconic menstrual artworks? Because since the late 1960s, artists have sporadically used menstrual blood. As part of a larger project, I've examined whether or not there is such a thing as a menstrual iconography, finding that the majority of menstrual images are not created by artists, but by corporations, advertising, and the medical establishment. As important visual markers of their own, these dominant images have been challenged by artists, whose images starkly contrast with the cheery packaging, sleek advertising, and glum medicalized versions of menstruation on view here. For instance, in Judy Chicago's Red Flag from 1971, the menstrual taboo is explored, but also alongside other issues. The title refers to communism, it nods to the ongoing Vietnam War, itself a critique of the US presidential politics of her time. While all this is perhaps subtextual, Chicago more clearly confronts corporate America with what she has termed her Tampax piece. These are the types of images that Chicago might have seen when she made the image. Tampax, owned by Tam Brands at the time and Procter & Gamble since the 1990s, was everywhere in the menstrual visual landscape in 1970s US history. The brand appropriated feminism but had none of the underlying values. For instance, Tampax, like other companies, segregated their advertising, featuring African American and white models separately, but they sold the same product, of course. Like the artists of the 21st century we've looked at, people interested in investigating menstrual taboos in the 1970s were often struck by this segregated imagery and how it had troubling connotations to issues about blood purity, kind of racist debates about this. In this type of artwork from the 70s, there's an inherent critique of the larger US corporate and political landscape. This undated memorandum from the Tampax Corporation shows how aware they were of this visual culture. Advertising such a sensitive topic to a national audience would require just the right touch, a combination of aggressive selling and delicate good taste. The fact that it's undated is interesting, and it could kind of be written in the 1930s or 2020, as the same combination is sought in advertising today and transgressed sometimes by artists. Like other works involving blood at the time, artists drew attention to the politics of blood and, amongst other issues, and also other issues like HIV. As such, we can see that early menstrual artworks from the 1970s were also never devoid of politics, although they're often discussed in essentialist gendered terms. Now, after Levy found herself in the chaos of going viral, she set up an auction and the work was bought by the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Germany. While on first glance, the military museum might seem like a strange home, this menstrual portrait, a home talk today has showed exactly how fitting a home it is. For a Jewish artist to have art acquired by a German military museum is profound. For a menstrual work to be seen as part of political history rather than, quote, mere menstrual experimentation, as it's sometimes been referred to, is also unusual. As such, the acquisition writes Levy's portrait into the history of political art. The Trump in the portrait is full of bloodlust, a reminder of his encouragement of neo-Nazi groups and the kind of frenzy response. The neo-Nazi groups at work in the US in the 21st century, of course, also have a direct relationship to German military history. Levy's work connects the dots, using her blood to capture both the moment of Trump's anger and the history and future of the causes that fuel him and endanger people like Levy, Floyd, and the Central Park Five. In her artist statements, she writes, this is a very generous artist who also has this streak of optimism. She says that she believes in the power of beauty and the beauty of faces as a portrait artist. And this can be extended to the Trump portrait very generously. I hope to plant a seed for how we look at people and how we learn to see each other. The intense copying of Levy's work, and I'm going to start to conclude now, often rendered it free from this goal, this political goal. It rendered it also free from its political context. making it a kind of bloodless simulacra of the original subject matter. But Levy's original artwork is different to these internet copies or the images I've even showed you today, which are also copies. The image itself is blood from a specific moment in time, but it also documents histories of violent blood and foreshadows the bloody violence that is to come if Trump wins in 2016. The devastating consequences of Trump's campaign are already alive in the closed blood-red eye of Levy's portrait. Yet, there is also an invitation for hope in the image, maybe. Whereas making an image of this size with other types of blood would have been difficult, Levy's use of menstrual blood suggests perhaps survival. Menstrual blood has recently been discussed as a vital health sign by medical experts who are finally recognizing what activist and feminist healthcare practitioners have known for a long time, that menstruation can be a marker of good or bad health and should be approached seriously as such. As Joanne Owusu recently explored in her work on menstruation and the Holocaust, managing menstruation in times of racialized violence is difficult, but it can also be a sign of survival and joy in the body. So that would be one interpretation. In this view, to paint a history of violent blood and trauma with menstrual blood is, perhaps, according to the artist, to suggest the possibility of survival. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, wonderful, thank you so much. That was a fantastic paper. I really enjoyed that. Such urgent, timely, and essential research. I'm so grateful for that contribution to the discussion today. I was particularly interested in the way you looked at the relationship between racism and misogyny as well. That was really powerful. Let's go to the Q&A. So just to remind everyone how it works, we're going to have another extra 10 minutes, so we'll finish up around 6:10. Either raise your hand if you have a question, and then we'll unmute you, and you can ask your question direct to Camilla and Hetta, or ask your question on Twitter, and I've got a couple already that people have asked. So while people are thinking of those, I might start with some on Twitter. So there's a question for Hetta. So also, by the way, there's been a huge reaction on Twitter. It's been wonderful to see how thrilled people have been by both of these papers. They've really enjoyed them. But anyway, so the question from Hope Doherty: loved the first Violent Fluids paper by Hetta Howes discussing medieval devotional portrayals of blood. Would love to ask a question if possible. How does the vengeful Christ tradition fit into the development of Christ from early medieval warrior to late medieval sufferer?
Great question. Thank you. And I think this feels like too neat an answer, but I wonder if it acts as a bit of a bridge. So the vengeful Christ tradition, for those who are not necessarily aware of it, is sort of the sort of more wrathful, not necessarily the wrathful God of the Old Testament, but somewhere between a Christ that is sort of loving and merciful to his followers, but also quite vengeful on those who do not. This is not an image that you get really in the works that I look at, which are very sort of focus on the love of God and maternal God. But I think there's one example I've written, as Eddie mentioned, on a lyric by William Herbert from the 14th century, where the Christ in that sort of seesaws between the sort of Christ I was talking about in my paper and then the more vengeful Christ, which feels like it links much back to the older tradition. So there are moments of sort of reflection on Christ's suffering, but also moments where Christ is sort of angry at his people for not protecting him, and there's no opportunity in the lyric for people to have any kind of active sort of engagement. So unlike in Passion Meditation, where you can think, oh, I'll run up and imagine myself helping, there's no space for that in the lyric. And I think, yes, so I think the sort of vengeful Christ isn't there in the works that I tend to look at, but I think does act as a little bit of a bridge between the sort of fearless warrior, but very removed Christ, and then sort of the much more compassionate one that the sort of devotional works I look at focus on.
That's super interesting. Thank you. I was wondering if I could ask a question for both of you from Twitter now, from Peter Funk. Fantastic lecture. Can both of you speak more on queerness as it relates to menstrual blood? I am an AFAB genderqueer person and I'm doing research on the relationship between menstrual bleeding and being non-binary.
Yes, I don't know especially exactly what more that to add, other than to kind of signpost that this is a really interesting. I'd like to kind of come at the question from a meta perspective, which is that within kind of menstrual studies, I think, and that's a really interdisciplinary field, there's always been a big group of people interested in queerness. And recently there's been books published like Brianna Fass' book on queerness, menstruation and psychology. Now, of course, I can't remember what it's called, but Brianna Fass, F-A-H-S, which is fantastic reading. And the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, based in the US, but an international organization, might be interesting for you to check out because they've recently posted a lot of information about how to get into that kind of research field, who are the experts in the field. So really, since the kind of late 60s, there's been research into this. And it's not just, we might assume that it's kind of medicalized research, but there's lots of kind of humanities approaches to it, social science approaches. So it's a really exciting time to get into the research. In terms of art, which is kind of my speciality, I can only add kind of what I showed, that there is a lot of queer and trans artists working on this topic. And I wonder if there always has been. That's something sometimes a little bit difficult to tease out. But I know that the artist B. Hughes, who is non-binary, has written a fantastic PhD on this, which is coming out soon. So get in touch with them. And from discussions we've had, it seems like even going back to kind of 60s, 70s, there's kind of good stuff in the archives there. So it's a really rich subject of study and a really inviting space, I think. I think menstrual studies have become very inclusive on this topic in particular. So I'm just excited to hear that more people are kind of studying it, but the artists certainly have been, talking about it for a long time.
Yeah, in terms of sort of medieval studies, I think this is, I think that's an excellent question, and it's also one that is sort of an area of increasing study. I know quite a few exciting sort of early career medieval scholars that are doing really interesting things. So I believe it's Sophie Robbins, I really hope I've got this right, who's doing a project on queering and the side wounds, Christ's body. Jonah Coleman is another one you can follow on Twitter. And this, I think, it's something I'm, interested in terms of, I think I said in the previous answer to the last question that there's a difference between a body being gender fluid and a body being more male. And I think what we see interestingly with these images of the vulva in the side looking like Christ's wound is that that's not, it's sort of traditionally been understood as a sort of feminizing of the body. So the tradition of Caroline Walker Bynum, which is a very strong one, which I'm, very invested in with my own research, talks about feminizing the body. But I think the sort of what scholars and I hope, and myself are increasingly aware of is that actually it might not be about feminizing, it might be about degenderizing or creating a body that is between genders. And I think fluids are such a great way of thinking through that, because fluids by nature slip between boundaries, can be one thing and then another, and are difficult to label, difficult to contain, but have this incredible potential to sort of slip, slide, disrupt, etc. So I think there's a lot of room and space, and people are already doing it, as I mentioned, to think through, not in the sort of traditional sense of feminizing, non-feminizing. And of course, talking about menstruation and stuff, like obviously, like in recent weeks, this has been in the news a lot, hasn't it? Only women can menstruate, which is not true, right? So, and not all women menstruate anyway. So I think it's I've never felt like my research is quite as relevant as in recent weeks, and certainly, you know, even saying that, so much more yours, Camilla, as well. Like, I think there's some very interesting discussion to be had.
Yeah, if I can just kind of follow on, if you mean the kind of the celebrity author tweet that we might all have seen, yeah, I think it's really interesting, you know, that kind of happens, and then it undermines all the work done by academics and artists and activists in this space. It really is. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure there's bad spots in the menstrual research community too, and activist community, but on a whole, that comment doesn't reflect us, I don't think, and it does so much damage, of course, for people in the community, but also for research. You know, you have to start again, and actually this has been a debate about inclusivity since the 60s, so it's just really frustrating, and we just have to keep pushing and keep making it super clear that it's an inclusive space.
Thank you so much. We have so many raised hands and questions on Twitter, but tragically we are out of time. I'm so sorry about
I'm happy to answer if anyone wants to DM me on Twitter, I'm happy to talk more.
You'll be able to find both of our speakers' Twitter bios if you go to @CourtauldGS or @CourtauldRes. I'm sure both of our speakers, you know, like Hetta's just said, would be super excited to keep the conversation going and would love to hear from you, especially if there's been anything you've appreciated about their talks tonight. I think it's always really important to let people know when they've done something brilliant. And I've so enjoyed the discussion today. And I've really loved the kind of intellectual energy between the two of you. I think the connections has been really, really wonderful. I've learned so much and I've really enjoyed it. So without further ado, I mean, it feels slightly weird to do this without audience applause, but I'd just like to thank you both and all of our attendees, and wish you all a lovely evening.